By 1971, the Manson family was effectively over, with Charles Manson and most of the killers convicted and on their way to death row. Charlie, who had always said prison was his real father, that he was just fine staying in, and had even argued not to be let out 4 years before, ahead of his 1967 release, was scared about facing his capital sentence. Death row is different than Gen Pop, and the added worries about retaliation for masterminding the murder of a pregnant woman and the shooting of a black drug dealer, who he may or may not have believed was affiliated with the Black Panther Party, compelled Manson to seek protection at San Quentin. He found that protection in the form of the Aryan Brotherhood. The Aryan Brotherhood is a whites-only prison gang affiliated with the Aryan Nation, a neo-Nazi white supremacist organization operating throughout the U.S. The Aryan Brotherhood, AB, is involved in many criminal activities within the penal system, including the targeting and murder of Black and Latino prisoners. In the prison system, gangs often form based on racial identity. The Aryan Brotherhood sought status by offering security, but they demanded a price. As writer Ed Saunders explained, Manson ordered his remaining family women to send nude photos of themselves to Aryan Brotherhood members in jail. They were apparently to provide sexual and housekeeping favors to Aryan Brotherhood members who left prison. Manson must have thought it was tactically smart to join forces with the Aryan Brotherhood because, in addition to his personal safety, he could keep track of wobbling followers on the outside. The move turned out to be a great blunder, however, because the Aryan Brotherhood was subsequently able to split the remnants of the Manson group into two bitter factions. In the first installment of our next series, What Became of the Manson Family, we start at the end, after the trials and convictions, with the associates of the family introduced through the Aryan Brotherhood. During the 1971 trial of Manson and several others for the murders of Gary Hinman and Donald Shorty Shea, Charlie requested a witness, an inmate at Folsom Prison named Kenneth Como. Como, aka Curly, was serving time on unrelated matters, 20 to life for armed robbery, to be specific. Como had not met Charlie, but from Folsom Prison brokered a deal between the cult leader and the Brotherhood. The AB would provide protection to Manson in prison, shielding him from black gangs, and in exchange, Manson encouraged the family women to act as comfort aids to incarcerated Aryan Brotherhood members, sending them masturbatory pictures of themselves. The AB, however, decided that Como would be a better leader to the family than Manson. They encouraged Charlie to subpoena Como as a witness in his upcoming Hinman-Shea trial, so Como could break him out of the courtroom. As a named witness in a murder trial, Como was transported to Los Angeles, but Curly never made it to court. He escaped and fled on foot ahead of his testimony. When Como fled from the Hall of Records, he joined the family. Within weeks, he committed armed robbery for his new gang. Como also usurped many of Charlie's women, including Catherine Gypsy Scher, Nancy Brenda Pittman, and Mary Bruner. On August 21st, Como and Dennis Rice led Gypsy, Mary, Little Larry, true name Lawrence Giddings, and Chuck Lovett to the Western Surplus Store in Hawthorne, California. This was an Army-Navy retailer which stocked weapons of many calibers. There they held up staff and customers at gunpoint and gathered more than 140 rifles to be used, ostensibly, to break Manson out of prison. But someone tripped a silent alarm bringing police to the scene. A shootout began, and when it was over, both Mary and Gypsy were wounded, and everyone was arrested with the exception of 19-year-old Lovett, who managed to flee undetected for several days. The robbers planned to steal the rifles, use them to break Manson out of prison, then hijack a plane to fly him out of the country. They also robbed a store in Covina a week earlier, making off with $2,600 in cash. Instead, more members of the family were facing incarceration. 8 days after his arrest for the Hawthorne incident, Como again escaped from jail. He was picked up by Sandy Good, who crashed her car and was promptly arrested. Como spent a few hours on the lam before he, too, was back in police custody. He was transferred back to Folsom, months after his initial escape during transfer. There, he would wait for the courts to proceed on the new charges. In the fall of '72, Charlie and Como found themselves face to face at Folsom. Manson had been transferred there from San Quentin after the death penalty was temporarily abolished in California earlier that year. A bloody fight broke out between them, and the Aryan Brotherhood pulled their protection of Manson. In a 1973 letter referring to the severed relationship between Charlie and the AB, Lynette Squeaky Frome wrote, "Aryan Brotherhood moves much on pure hate, as they want him to kill Black because Black is Black. He will not do this, and they are against him." Como, Giddings, Mary, and Gypsy all pled not guilty by reason of insanity to their charges for the Hawthorne robbery and shootout. At a sanity hearing in 1973, Como admitted that his rap sheet revealed 45 arrests in the past 17 years, or half his life, including for robbery, assault, and narcotics possession. He acknowledged that he'd spent 5 years earlier in prison for stealing a car from an El Monte used lot. That being deemed a bad guy while still in his teens had an emotional impact on him, and he referred to the California prison system as a most vicious, dehumanizing experience that I wouldn't put my dog through. The insanity plea didn't stick for any of the four, and they were convicted for the Hawthorne shootout and the Covina robbery. Rice and Lovett were also convicted for their roles in the crimes. Como got 15 years to life. Gypsy and Mary were also sentenced to prison, serving at the same women's facility as Susan Atkins, Patricia Krenwinkel, and Leslie Van Houten. Reunited with her Manson sisters, Gypsy bragged about her relationship with Como, including how much better he was than Charles Manson, and confiding about other heists they were planning. In autumn 1972, several former members and affiliates of the family were living in Gurneville, California, in Sonoma County. They included Nancy Brenda Pittman, Priscilla Tuffy Cooper, Maria Crystal Alonzo, and the men they were each romantically involved with. Those men were Michael Monfort, James Craig, and William Goucher. The circle also included a married couple from back east, James and Lauren Willett. The Willettes had a daughter, Heidi, who was just 8 months old. James L. Willett was born in Kentucky to a family well known for making whiskeys, bourbons, and ryes. The Willett family, in fact, today owns an 88-year-old company bearing their name. James was known as a kind young man, a Marine Corps and Vietnam veteran who had been honorably discharged, while Lauren, who was from Connecticut, was shy and devoted to her family. How they got involved with the Mansonites is uncertain. They met up in the Los Angeles area, perhaps a year before. James liked to go fishing, and while in Gurneville, he sometimes visited a nearby chapel for the Baha'i, a peaceable faith that originated, but is now prohibited, in Iran. Lauren had dropped out of school and left home, to the consternation of her folks. We do not know when, where, or how James and Lauren, who went by the nickname Rennie, met, but the two appeared to have been typical nomadic hippie types who went west, as so many young people did in that era. Michael Monfort, James Craig, and William Gusher were all members of the Aryan Brotherhood, all former inmates, and all involved in a string of armed robberies across Central California. James Willett apparently joined them in those crimes. When he tried to get out, the other three killed him, and a month later, Lauren was also murdered. As mentioned earlier, Kenneth Como and the Aryan Brotherhood managed to fracture the remnants of Charlie's family. Nancy Pittman was allied with Squeaky and Sandy, but then the former surfer girl from Malibu went in a different direction. Pittman was dating Michael Lee Monfort, aka Red Eye. Monfort, 24, who escaped from a state-run prison work camp, met Pittman through the Aryan Brotherhood Manson Family connection. Though Charlie was no longer under the protection of the AB, some of the women had maintained correspondences with the men they'd been sending their explicit selfies to. We know little about Michael's early life, except that in 1950, at 1 year of age, federal census records show that he was living on Vina Avenue in the Pacoima neighborhood of Los Angeles with his mother, an older brother, and his maternal grandmother. A lack of a father figure might have had some bearing on the life of crime he found himself in as a young adult. James Spider Terrell Craig, an Aryan Brotherhood member and an ex-con with a long criminal record, was involved with Priscilla Cooper, aka Tuffy, a post-trial associate of the family. Tuffy, Brenda, and Maria Alonso, known as Crystal, were living together in mid-1972. Tuffy was a troubled young woman, a high school dropout who gave birth to an illegitimate son in her teens and ran with motorcycle gangs long before she met the Manson family. By the time she got involved with Craig, she had carved an X on her forehead like her Manson sisters, and later she tattooed Craig's nickname, Spider, on her arm. In the 1950 census, Craig, age 10, lived with his parents and younger sister in an apartment in the San Pedro area near Los Angeles. However, he was born in Oklahoma. Possibly the family relocated west during the World War II era. James' mother, Nana, who was originally from Arkansas, died in 1953 at the age of 37. He was just 12 years old. And his father, well, his name was Jesse James Craig. I guess young Spider was sort of fated into a life of crime. Craig was arrested at the age of 18 for narcotics possession with 2 friends. That same year, he was sent to juvie for robbery and forging just over $80 in checks. A year later, he was arrested again for heroin possession. Later newspaper accounts listed his first felony incarceration in 1963, when Craig was 24 years old. That was the result of holding up and robbing a liquor store. He also pistol-whipped the clerk before police showed up. Maria Alonso, who was introduced to the family through Susan Atkins, dated Monfort's buddy and fellow escapee, William Gusher. Billy Gusher was 23, a career criminal covered in jailhouse tattoos. The 3 couples, Pittman Monfort, Cooper Craig, Alonzo Gusher, were living in Stockton during the commission of the aforementioned robberies. However, it is believed that the group met the Willetts in the Los Angeles area the year before. According to James Willett's father back in Kentucky, his son had called him months before to say he was afraid of the Manson-affiliated group. The senior Willett had the impression that his son, daughter-in-law, and granddaughter were being held hostage by the others. In the summer of '72, Pittman rented a home in Gurneville at Parker Resort, a logging community in the pristine Sonoma County forestry area on the Russian River. The group then moved from Stockton to Gurneville. On October 29th, Michael Monfort, James Craig, William Gusher, Nancy Pittman, Priscilla Cooper, and Lauren and Heidi Willett drove back to Stockton in James Willett's 1965 Ford station wagon. Nancy Pittman, using the name Karen Willett, rented a home on West Flora Avenue in Stockton. She paid a $290 security deposit in cash. On October 30th, Gusher and Monfort, using James Willett's ID, were arrested for robbing a liquor store just a few blocks from the West Flora residence. Gusher was held over, but Monfort posted $10,000 bail. That bail was issued to Willett, not realizing he was already deceased. Then, on November 9th, a man out hiking near Gurneville saw a human hand sticking out of the ground and called police. The body was none other than James Willett. He'd been marched to a field by Monfort, Craig, and Gusher, told to dig a hole before the three men took turns firing rounds into his body. The day of the discovery of the body of James Willett, his wife Lauren was shot to death by Michael Monfort at the Stockton house. It is believed that she had learned of her husband's murder. She was shot above her right eye with a .38. During this time, police were searching for James Willett, believing that he was Monfort, who had failed to appear in court and triggered a skip trace for the return of his bail. On November 10th, Squeaky Frome showed up at the West Flora home looking for Nancy Pittman. She had traveled there by bus and spent the night. The next day, she went to visit Gusher in jail. That same day, police were tipped off that James Willett's car was seen in front of the Flora address and showed up to investigate. Someone slammed a door in their face, and they forced entry into the home. There, police found Nancy Pittman holding baby Heidi, the infant daughter of James and Lauren. Pittman gave the alias Lauren Olmsted, Rennie's maiden name, and claimed she was babysitting the child and that Heidi's parents had gone back to Kentucky. Pittman, Monfort, Cooper, and Craig were then arrested. During their arrest, Squeaky called the house from jail. After visiting with Gusher, she wanted someone to come pick her up. She had no idea she was talking to the Fuzz, who happily arranged to get her, and she too was arrested. On November 12th, police obtained a search warrant for the West Flora home and found Lauren Willett's body buried underneath it. Baby Heidi was taken into protective custody, and later her maternal grandparents claimed her. On November 13th, Monfort, Craig, and Gusher were formally charged with the murder of James Willett. On the 14th, Priscilla Tuffy Cooper told investigators that Rennie was accidentally shot by Monfort with a pistol. Police believed, instead, that Lauren was killed to shut her up about her husband's murder and the robberies. The following information was found at Manson blog. Michael Lee Monfort was the first to shoot James Willett in the back with a Sturm Ruger .22 caliber automatic pistol, which knocked him face down. William Merlin Gusher aimed the next shot at the back of Willett's neck with a 12-gauge shotgun. James Spider Craig proceeded to fire with yet another shotgun as Willett lay face down on the ground. They then cleaned out Mr. Willett's pockets, rolled him down the hill, and then just kicked some leaves and dirt over his body. The police and coroner were never certain as to the exact day James Willett was murdered. They determined it was around October 17th, 1972. Gusher pled guilty to second-degree murder for killing James Willett and agreed to testify against Craig and Monfort. With that testimony against them, Monfort and Craig agreed to plead out. However, a jury had already been selected in June 1973, and the trial begun before the plea deal happened. Nancy Pittman and Priscilla Cooper were brought from Frontera to testify against their men. Monfort and Craig each tried to marry their girlfriends to prevent their testimony, to no avail. Goucher, however, had already married Maria Alonso 4 months before the trial began. Nancy was charged as an accessory to murder in Rennie's death. During Monfort and Craig's trial, Maria attempted to smuggle a switchblade into court and was arrested. Charges against Squeaky were dropped. William Goucher, Michael Monfort, and James Craig were found guilty of second-degree murder. Nancy also did time for her role in the murder of Lauren Willett. So, what happened to the killers after they were convicted? Goucher's plea deal included a proviso that he not be sentenced to serve in California, where the AB would have immediately taken him out for snitching on his brothers. So for his 7-year sentence, he was first remanded to a prison in Idaho. However, 3 years later, in 1976, administrators at that prison deemed Goucher as an undermining, agitating, militant radical, so he was sent to Oxford, Wisconsin. He spent much of his time in Oxford in solitary confinement and was later transferred to Leavenworth in Kansas. Meanwhile, in 1973, his brother Veldon married former family member Catherine Kitty Ludesinger. Veldon and Kitty were married for 5 years before splitting. Goucher and Maria Alonso, who he married in early 73, divorced in 1977, and the following year he married a woman named Nina in Reno. He was a free man, paroled for the murder of James Willett. But months later, in December 1978, Goucher assaulted a couple after the woman had been in a traffic accident with Goucher's sister. He held both the woman and her boyfriend captive in their home, and then the former Aryan Brotherhood member stabbed the man, who died as a result of his injuries. The victim, Raymond Hanley, was a black man. Billy and Nina fled to his home state of Nebraska, where he got picked up on an unrelated assault charge, which led police to discover the charges related to the stabbing of Hanley back in California. His wife Nina actually testified against Goucher at trial. At the time, she was wanted for writing bad checks in Wyoming, plus she was involved in a child custody matter in which she was alleged to be an unfit mother. Goucher was convicted of murder on November 21, 1979, and sentenced to 33 years to life. In 1981, Goucher appealed his conviction, claiming the incident stemmed from the other driver, a Mrs. Torres, Hanley's significant other, refusing to pay for the damages to his sister's car, claiming she had no auto insurance and was indigent. He also argued against the leverage applied to his wife to compel her testimony against him. His appeal was denied, and he was remanded back to Chino. You can see this article includes a letter written by Billy about his life behind bars. He and Nina divorced shortly after his appellate denial. William Merlin Goucher got out of prison on an unknown date, and he died around 2010 in the Antelope, California area. After being sentenced for his role in the murder of James Willett in 1972, Spider Craig was out in 1978. Although he and Tuffy were no longer together, she had given birth to a daughter by him before she fell into deeper drug addiction and criminal activity. The daughter was being raised by an elderly couple connected to her family. Spider Craig was still connected to the Aryan Brotherhood at the time of his release. He was friends with another former inmate and AB member named Ed Barabbas. Barabbas was 27 years old and had served 3 years at Folsom for armed robbery. On November 15, 1978, a burning car, a gold 1967 Dodge, a stolen vehicle, was discovered in Sacramento with 2 men inside. One was James Craig. The other was Edward Barabbas. Barabbas was dead. Craig had also been shot in the face. He survived his shooting and was pulled from the burning car. Craig tried to tell police who attacked him and Barabbas, but they couldn't understand him. 3 days later, a man named Robert Harry Christmas turned himself in to the Sacramento PD, claiming that he and 3 others shot Craig and Barabbas and put them in the burning car. James Craig survived another month in the burn unit at UC Davis Medical Center before dying from his injuries. Craig's last words before he was put into a medically induced coma were, "She's dangerous, she's dangerous." Now what's interesting is that at the time of his and Barabbas' murders, Barabbas was living with none other than Priscilla Tuffy Cooper. Good old Tuffy had been the she that Spider, her ex, tried to warn police about. While in prison serving his second-degree murder convictions for James and Lauren Willett, Monfort married Nancy Pittman. When Brenda was released, she and Monfort, still in prison, were married. Their wedding date was January 27, 1976, in jail, and Monfort fathered 3 sons with her. During the last years of this incarceration, Monfort served them at the California Training Facility in Soledad, California. He was released in May 1984 for his role in the Willett's deaths, with approval from the parole board, to live in Napa Valley, where Brenda and their boys, the 2 elder, the youngest was born after Monfort got out, had been living since '81. Nancy's parents had purchased the home several years before, while Nancy was still serving her sentence, and Monfort also had relatives in the nearby area. Michael lined up a job, and the parole board agreed that his plans seemed to be in the community's best interests. The Monforts lived in Napa under assumed names, but as soon as Michael was off parole, they sold the house and moved away. But Michael Monfort just couldn't stay on the up and up. He was plagued with drug and alcohol addiction. Nancy divorced him in 1990, while Monfort continued his spree of robberies across Central California. In 1996, after a string of robberies in the Sacramento area, Monfort was arrested again, and with California's new 3 strikes law, those charges were added cumulatively. He was sentenced to 878 years in prison. Michael Lee Monfort died on July 3, 2005, while serving time of natural causes. And what about Kenneth Como, aka Curly, the man who masterminded the protection agreement of Charles Manson by the Aryan Brotherhood? Gypsy, who was released from prison in 1977, married Como while he was still serving time for the Hawthorne shootout. He was paroled and released in 1981. But in '83, he was captured in El Monte after robbing a savings and loan of $6,000. He was held without bail. In January of 1984, Como pled guilty to the robbery and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. During that incarceration, Gypsy divorced him. He was released from prison in 2003. Just 1 year later, in September 2004, Kenneth Daniel Como died of cancer. Many thanks to Manson Blog, where I was able to source some of the information in this video, particularly about the murder of the Willetts. And a huge thank you goes out to Dan Hale, my buddy and one of my favorite researchers. His information on William Gusher and James Craig, in particular, was invaluable. Stay tuned. The next installment of What Became of the Manson Family is coming up very soon.